Good morning, everyone. Today we'll look at the Canadian fur trade, and more specifically, the circular relationship between exploration and exploitation that was apparent during the early 17th to late 19th century. The thesis of my essay is as follows. Canada's geography was mapped and its natural resources depleted because of the fur industry that consumed North America. In order to validate my thesis, my research guided me to the following areas: the causes of the fur trade, various explorers and their achievements, some of the larger fur monopolies and their influences, as well as what caused the eventual demise of the trade. In order to understand the enormity of the fur trade in North America and its influence, it is critical to first understand how it came to be. The North American fur trade revolved around the beaver hat, a staple in every gentleman's attire. The beaver hat was sought after in Europe because of the desire of the upper classes to visibly distance themselves from those below them, the fascination and interest in the recently discovered New World, and the beaver hat's superior characteristics to previous felt designs. An interesting fact is that the fashionable beaver hat originated from the Swedish Army, but was eventually used worldwide. For example, in the United States, Captain Thomas Truxtun of the USS Constellation offered his men a beaver hat and 2 months advance pay for those who re-enlisted. The beaver hat quickly became the symbol of the man's social and economic status, much like a car, house, or phone is today. And now for the explorers, which comprised an important part of this circular relationship. Pierre Esprit Radisson was one of the first explorers to greatly influence the fur trade. Radisson grew up in indigenous communities in New France, learning the skills necessary to become a successful trader. He, along with his brother-in-law, completed many expeditions into the interior, amassing fortunes in fur. The two adventurers are credited with mapping much of the area surrounding the Great Lakes. However, his most famous achievement was his trade in the Hudson's Bay region, which led to the creation of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670. The HBC became the largest fur monopoly in the world, and also the greatest exploiter of the North American beaver. Another renowned explorer was Alexander Mackenzie. In 1789 and 1793, he was funded by the Northwest Company to find a passage over land to the Pacific. He succeeded on the second voyage, having reached the Arctic Ocean by chance on the first. The Northwest Company, in particular, invested heavily in exploration in order to increase profits. It is important here to note that the NWC was not as large as the HBC and thus could not compete directly with them. A Northwest Passage would bypass the dangerous and expensive overland route and the middlemen of eastern Canada when transporting furs. Furthermore, untouched beaver hunting grounds and trade routes were sought after by all, as they were great sources of income. It is therefore apparent that much of Canada was explored and mapped during the fur trade for business purposes. David Thompson was another revered explorer and cartographer who was fueled by the fur industry. His life's work consisted of mapping approximately 1/5 of North America. Thompson was employed by the HBC, but later opted instead for the NWC in favor of better company policies. By the early 19th century, much of the prime beaver habitat had been exploited and populations were thinning. Exploitation then forced the hand of exploration, as new territories needed to be explored in order for companies to stay in business. Enter David Thompson. Thompson mapped vast regions of Canada, which led to further exploitation of natural resources. This cycle very nearly eliminated the North American beaver completely. One of Thompson's main achievements was mapping an accurate political border following the War of 1812, a war partly brought about over control of the lucrative fur trade. His skills helped to prevent any further conflict over land disputes between the Americans and the British. Another explorer who left his legacy during the fur trade was Samuel Hearne. Hearne had served in the Royal Navy since the age of 12 and saw considerable action during the 7 Years' War. As a young adult, he transferred to the HBC and went into the exploration business. Out of the 3 official expeditions he undertook, only the final one was successful, as his native guides stripped him of his possessions and left him to die in the Arctic tundra on the first 2. Nevertheless, he has been recognized as one of Canada's finest explorers. As beaver populations became more and more pressured, and thus less profitable, The HBC began to expand their horizons to encompass different natural resources like minerals. Hearne's exploration of the Coppermine River was a prime example of the circular relationship between exploration and exploitation. When the exploitation of the beaver became detrimental to their overall population, the HBC turned to other venues of income. This was an important turning point as almost all territory was subject to exploration, even those without any prospect of fur. The most powerful company during the fur trade was the HBC, which still exists today, although the modern company bears no relation to what it once was. The HBC was founded in 1670 by Prince Rupert of England to usurp the French Compagnie des Sans Associés, which had thus far dominated the fur trade. The HBC was granted Rupert's Land, on which they could trap and trade, an area some 8 million square kilometers surrounding Hudson's Bay. Since they were entitled to the best beaver habitat in the world, they did not invest as much in further exploration as some others did, for they had no need to. The HBC's only real competition was the Northwest Company, which was founded in 1789 when a multitude of private trading companies in Montreal merged together. Since they had no royal or otherwise official backing, they had no land allotted to them. The NWC therefore informally claimed the land west of Rupert's Land as their own. The Northwest was relatively untouched, and therefore the NWC invested heavily into exploration in order to increase profits. In other words, their exploitation of the land was derived from exploration. However, tensions between these two companies reached a climax in 1816 in what later came to be known as the Battle of the Seven Oaks. After the smoke cleared, the NWC was forced to merge with the HBC. The HBC then continued unopposed for the remainder of the fur trade. Like all things, the North American fur trade was not invincible. The European market, which had fueled the trade for centuries, was dramatically reduced during the mid-19th century for two primary reasons. The first being that a method had been discovered where rabbit fur could be manipulated to assume a beaver fur-like quality. Rabbits, of course, are much more common than beavers, especially in Europe, which made the North American beaver obsolete. The second reason for the downfall of the fur trade was a shift in European fashion, a fad, if you will. The style of the day was now silk, and individuals parading in the streets with beaver hats were considered outdated. These factors devastated the fur trade, but the beaver populations rebounded from the brink of extinction. The effects of this cyclical interaction were negative for many parties involved. For example, the North American beaver was driven almost to extinction before being protected in the early 20th century. The beaver was not the only one to suffer during the fur trade. First Nations across North America were negatively affected by the trade both directly and indirectly. Most accounts dictate that while the trade with natives was fair, and that neither side took advantage of the other, there were secondary, devastating effects on the First Nations. For example, the natives who engaged in the fur trade no longer had the time to live a subsistence lifestyle and became dependent on European trade goods. Moreover, with the fall of the fur trade, many Europeans no longer had the need for their counterparts' skills. Ultimately, the First Nations people suffered greatly from the North American fur trade. The legacy of the fur trade is considerable, although it deserves more attention than it currently receives. The cycle of exploitation and exploration continues in modern day, and the world would do well to look at the outcomes of it in the past. The parties that were subject to the cycle usually suffered greatly. However, not all aspects of the legacy are negative. The beaver, the animal on which this country was built upon, is now the national animal and symbolized in many aspects of Canadian culture.
The importance of the fur trade is ultimately the creation of Canada and the United States as countries. Many people believe that, in the early days of exploration and colonization, European powers would not have invested as much time or resources into the New World had it not been for furs. Without the wealth in furs that could be found across Canada, European settlements may have remained on the East Coast, where natural resources in the form of timber and fish abounded. For better or for worse, the vast majority of North America was mapped and explored because of the beaver.
Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I hope you have learned something new. Enjoy the rest of your day.